For example, in last 2 years, United States Development Agency provide new grant for Central Asian countries, or United States also create new platform for critical minerals with Central Asian countries. They are correct, but currently they are all in limited because they are based on dialogue rather than particular actions. So that's why I can say that the United States actually active like European Union or the China in Central Asia currently, but it's evident that there is also a shift in United States, the attention towards Central Asia. And I expect that particular importance of Central Asia getting grow in the United States foreign policy, at least in the medium term.
When one speaks to Western stakeholders frequently, the dominant framing or the dominant assumption is that small is beautiful was kind of like flowery language put on top to sweeten what is essentially a budget reduction, like a funding reduction. And I think, sure, there is some truth there. But I think what isn't actually, taken into account there is that small is beautiful actually plays very much into this changed landscape where you can drop microgrids across the landscape wherever you want to, rather than, kind of having to be bound to the logic of having to connect everything back to a big city.
We had a chart the other day in the newsletter that we showcased about Chinese coal production last year. It's pretty significant. And I'll leave everybody with this thought. I know the Chinese say we are entitled because we have the second largest population in the world and we're a developing country, and so we didn't cause the problem. The problem is today is that when we use that logic, it's like saying we're peeing in 1/3 of the pool. Okay, and if you're still in that pool, you're not safe. And that's the world we live in. So there's a robust argument on the Chinese side to say, you know what? You can't criticize us if you're hurling insults from New York and London and Brussels. Sorry, just not going to take that.
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, and as always, I'm joined by CGSP's managing editor, Cobus van Staden in beautiful Cape Town, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, today we're going to focus on Central Asia, and there's been a lot happening there, particularly in the green energy space. But before we get to Central Asia, it's really important that we're going to work our way up along China's periphery from South Asia, in part because there have been some dramatic developments over the past week that really are just eye-opening. And I think it's a lot of news that many people may not have heard about or are focusing on, in part because of so much else that's going on in the world today. And these are the kinds of stories that often just kind of slip through the cracks. Well, first, this big, announcement that came out of New Delhi last week. It's been 1 week now since India's Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri announced that India and China had reached some kind of détente that would withdraw troops from 3 sectors along the two countries' contested border. And this is high up in the Tibetan Plateau. Now, what's amazing is over the past week, the speed with which things have been happening. So let me give you a tick-tock. We started on Monday when we got this announcement. Then I think it was Tuesday or Wednesday, Xi and Modi had their speech. On Wednesday, troops literally on Wednesday, just within 24 hours, PLA troops started pulling back from 3 sectors. And then they are expecting by the following Tuesday, we're recording this on Monday, which means tomorrow, within 1 week, those troops will be pulled back. And that is just a pace of movement that we are not accustomed to between India and China. So they both seem to be determined to move forward with this. We're starting to find out new details of the deal. It's starting to come under pressure in the Indian parliament. The opposition Congress party over the weekend started pressuring Misri as to why wasn't there a joint statement. They want to know more about the deal. So, and then in the Chinese press, a lot of bravado coming in and saying that they brought the Indians to the table and the Indians made the concession. So there's a lot of ways, Cobus, that this thing can still go sideways, but it is a dramatic development and progress seems to be moving at an exceptional speed. Let me continue with our tour of South Asia, moving our way up to Central Asia. In Pakistan on Friday, Ambassador Zhang Zaidong, he held a press conference, a very rare press conference, where he brought together some local journalists and was just shockingly blunt in his criticism of the Pakistani government, demanding that they take concrete action to better protect Chinese nationals who've been the victims of terrorist attacks by separatist militants. Again, we don't hear this from Chinese envoys very often, especially from ostensibly friendly countries like Pakistan. And he said really just that this isn't fair to Chinese nationals who are working in the country, that they have to suffer like this. And he was very unapologetic. And so it does reveal a few strains in the Sino-Pakistan relationship on this security issue. And then finally, on the last week on Thursday, there was a breakthrough announcement in Afghanistan where Ambassador Zhao Xing posted a photo on X of his meeting with Abdul Kabir, who is the Taliban deputy prime minister, saying that China is going to provide free trade, basically, for Afghan products coming into the Chinese market. Now, that sounds like a cool deal, but let's remember that last year, Afghanistan exported just $64 million worth of goods. 90% of that was in the form of just pine nuts. So not a very diverse trade relationship, but it does mark China's embrace of the Taliban government, and China was one of the first governments to recognize the Taliban, and it shows kind of movement towards formalizing its diplomatic ties with the Taliban while the rest of the world still keeps the Taliban at arm's length. Cobus, when you hear all of these developments along the periphery, taking into account everything that we're seeing in the U.S. election, we're seeing elsewhere in the geopolitical, environment and the landscape, what do you think? What comes to mind?
I mean, it's all very interesting to hear. There's clearly a lot of work being done, on the Chinese side to try and shore up their near periphery. And of course, in the case of South Asia and also Central Asia, a lot of that is also connected to logistics and transport corridors that they're setting up through the region, as part both of near neighborhood, engagement and Belt and Road issues. So it's all very interesting. It is interesting also for me that China is moving forward with this trade relationship with Afghanistan. As you said, Afghanistan isn't producing a lot now, but it does, of course, also have very large mineral reserves. So that could be interesting. And also the hard line China's taking in Pakistan is interesting in the context that Pakistan frequently blames Afghanistan for harboring some of these terrorists. And there's even been rumors in Pakistan about plans for some kind of cross-border operation around this. So the China's engagement with both Pakistan and Afghanistan puts it in an interesting position in that respect.
Yeah, my guess on Afghanistan is that the focus for the Chinese is to maximize stability rather than really foster a robust trade relationship, in part because the cost of extracting anything out of the ground in Afghanistan will probably be incredibly high, given the low price of minerals and metals that we have today. So lithium, nickel, and cobalt, I think there's a lot of lithium in Afghanistan, is quite cheap. And so the cost of just building the infrastructure, securing those supply lines, much like what we see in Pakistan, is very difficult. And let's not forget that in Afghanistan, ISIL, the terrorist group, they've already targeted China. And they've already attacked hotels with Chinese nationals in them just a couple of years ago. So they do face some security challenges in Afghanistan from Islamic militants there too. But let's focus on Central Asia in particular today, in part because that is one of the most interesting areas in China's periphery, because it's one of the only areas where the United States does not have any presence of any kind. And so when we look at the lattice work of U.S. security partnerships and alliances around China, you have this big gaping hole in Central Asia. And that's what makes this very interesting. Central Asia is also the gateway for a lot more traffic. You talked about these corridors, but rail traffic going to Europe. And then also the relationship from energy from Central Asia into China. But energy is changing now because we typically associate Central Asia with oil and gas. But now more and more, China is selling green energy and green technology into these Central Asian countries because they face many of the same problems that we've talked about in other global South countries. While they are producers of a lot of energy, they don't have the refining capacity, so they have to import a lot of energy. So it makes a lot of sense that they would start to shift to green technology and green energy production as a way to reduce those import costs. We had the opportunity last week to speak with one of the top experts in the field in this. I'm very excited to bring you this discussion. Yunis Sharifli is an independent foreign policy analyst who specializes in China-Eurasia relations, and he specifically focuses on connectivity and energy. He had a commentary earlier this year published on the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace website, which I'll put in the show notes. Green New Wave, How China Adapts to Central Asia's Renewable Energy Landscape. Let's take a listen to our interview with Yunis. Yunis Sharifli, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It's wonderful to have you on the program.
Thank you very much, Eric and Cobus. Nice to meet you. Thanks for your invitation.
It's great. We're going to cover a lot of ground in our discussion today, in part because Eurasia is such a big landmass, and it's also, especially in this day and age, where the issues from Central Asia all the way out to Turkey are oftentimes overlooked by the wars in Ukraine and also Gaza, the Middle East, and obviously what's happening here in the South China Sea. So a lot of the issues that you focus on in your research are not getting as much attention, which is why we want to focus on them today. We're going to start with your paper that you wrote for Carnegie on the Green New Wave and how China adapts to Central Asia's renewable energy landscape. I found this interesting because when I think of Eurasia, particularly Kazakhstan, the first thing that comes to my mind is that this is a major oil-producing country and that this is not necessarily going to be the green fields of renewable energy would bloom in a place like Central Asia. Kazakhstan, in fact, is the 12th largest oil producer in the world. And that's one of the reasons why I was a little bit surprised by some of the insights that you shared. And you said over the past 7 to 8 years, the Chinese have actually pivoted their energy strategy in Central Asia, particularly in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. And you said that's happened in 2 distinct phases. Let's start with this shift in Central Asia and this newfound focus on green energy in these 2 countries.
So, as you noted, there is a 2 distinct periods about China's investment to renewable energy landscape of Central Asian countries, particularly Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Actually, I would like to start with the first phase, but generally, I would like to give brief information. So, as you said, generally since 1990s, China and Chinese companies prefer to invest traditional energy resource of Central Asian countries, particularly gas and oil, in terms of renewable energy and hydropower energy, particularly in, again, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Kyrgyzstan. However, we can also, in addition to traditional energy resources, if we focus on the renewable energy, we saw that in the first phase cover, for example, from 2000 to 2015 or 2018, we saw that China relatively focused on the hydropower energy resource rather than solar and wind power. There are actually a range of the reason about that. The first, the Central Asian countries' own priorities, mostly they try to draw investment to hydroelectric or hydropower. Then that's why Chinese companies or Chinese banks very eager to invest it or give credit to these countries. And another point is about that in this first phase from 2000 to 2018, we can say that actually solar and wind power is still expensive for Central Asian countries. The investment itself is expensive for the companies, also Central Asian countries, to try to draw the other companies' intention or their interest. However, after 2015, we saw that there's an increasing investment from Chinese side. This investment generally adapt 2 important factors from the Chinese side and Central Asian countries side. From Chinese side, we saw that due to the debt sustainability problems of China's Belt and Road Initiative or other investments, and also growing discontent about Chinese investment, particularly related to air pollution or environmental problems, China itself started to change its strategy from large-scale projects to, they officially say, small and beautiful projects, means solar and wind, renewable energy projects. This is the Chinese side, but in Central Asian countries, despite, as you mentioned, the vast energy resource, they also, due to the increasing the population size, increasing domestic energy consumptions, on the other hand, there is a growing energy shortage, particularly in, for example, limited gas processing capacity of Kazakhstan or decreasing gas production in Uzbekistan. These countries also start to pay attention to utilize the renewable energy resource. In addition, after Russia-Ukraine war start, Russia also pivot its interest to Central Asia and try to export as much as gas export to Central Asian countries. And this also enables Central Asian countries to look to renewable energy resource, utilize renewable energy resource in order to decrease their dependence on Russian gas imports. So in this context, in the second stage, we saw that both China and Central Asian countries' interests overlap, and both of them interests align, and Chinese companies start to invest, particularly in the second stage after 2015. We saw that most of investment goes through the solar investment and wind energy, particularly it's concentrated in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan.
So talking about continuing the theme that you mentioned about Russian influence, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more broadly about how this energy transition is connected to political issues. Like working more closely with China, which is on the one side of these countries, is happening in a complicated political moment, kind of where Russia is involved in the Ukraine war, and therefore is also, its influence is shifting on the other side of these countries. So I was wondering, if you could talk a little bit more about how the energy cooperation is playing in the larger political field between China and Russia in Central Asia.
Yes, absolutely. As you see, actually, China is one of the main export country for Russia's energy resource. However, as you mentioned it, after the Russian-Ukraine war, a range of sanctions start to apply on Russia and its energy sector. So in this context, we saw that actually shift from Russian foreign policy, particularly in energy export, from west to east. But east doesn't only mean China, but it also covers India, but in relative terms also Central Asian countries, because particularly after 2022 we saw that Russia tried to create gas union with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, but also it tried to involve Kyrgyzstan. However, the countries in here is Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So as I mentioned it, currently there is due to the increasing population and increasing domestic energy consumption, we saw that Central Asian countries try to invest in renewable energy resource, but Russia also tried to export more gas to Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. So in the large scale, if we pay attention to, we saw that the main aim is the green transition is not only about environment, not only about new economic opportunities or draw investment from Chinese side, but it's also about larger energy geopolitics, because transition to green energy enable to Central Asian countries, particularly in the long term, not in the short term, medium and long term, decrease their dependence on Russia and import less gas resource from Russia. Because as you know, in addition to energy, Central Asian countries connected to Russia in terms of trade. For example, 80% of the import of Uzbekistan comes through the Russia, or more than 80% of Kazakhstan energy export to Europe goes through Russia. There's already interdependent relationship, and there is also huge the influence of Russia over the Central Asian countries. However, the green transition at least create new opportunities for local countries of Central Asia to create new investment opportunities in terms of renewable energy, at least decrease their dependence on Russia and follow more energy, balanced energy foreign policy, so they can import gas from Russia. Also, they try to utilize their own domestic resource, but also try to invest renewable energy. So the main aim is here, not only the economy, as I note, the economy and environment, but also continue to follow multi-vector foreign policy, the create energy security, most importantly, independent from China and Russia. So the main aim of the Central Asian countries is continue to follow their multi-vector foreign policy and balanced foreign policy in the long term.
I get how they want to be more autonomous and they want their independence, but at the end of the day, you wrote in your article that the Chinese are also instrumental in formulating regulatory policies in both countries. And so it raises this question that while they don't want to become dependent on, or they want to reduce their dependency on Russian energy, at the same time, it feels like there's a pull to become dependent on Chinese technology, Chinese management, and also Chinese standards and norm setting as well. That to me feels like it could unearth some of the traditional Sino-Russian tensions over influence in this part of the world that Russia has long considered to be within its traditional sphere of influence.
Yes, actually, it's correct, because in article, as you mentioned it, I wrote that in the long term, China's export of technology, huge concentration of the renewable energy investment, enabled China to transform its traditional role from just norm taker to norm maker in Central Asia. But in this context, also, I try to draw your attention to, for example, as we know, generally, when we talk about Central Asian countries, we talk about Russia-China relations, or mostly the academicians prefer to refer to Great Game, where, for example, Russia and China is independent countries and Central Asian countries is a less independence in foreign policy. But in this context, In the long term, if these local countries prefer to only draw investment from China, yes, they absolutely can create not only resource dependency or export dependence on China, but it's also create technological dependency, which is actually much complicated and in the long term can create huge leverage for China over Central Asian countries. However, we saw that, for example, Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan, they not only negotiate renewable energy investments with China. For example, in also article I referred that Uzbekistan organized tenders, Kazakhstan organized auctions, and Chinese companies actively involved this. However, for example, Masdar from United Arab Emirates, Aqua Energy from Saudi Arabistan, or Western countries such as Total from France, they also involved. And we saw that, yes, currently there's increasing trends from the Chinese side, but European countries or the countries from the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, also try to increase their influence or invest renewable energy market of Central Asian countries. So in this context, we should pay attention to not just Russia and China, but more large scale, how European Union try to penetrate, how the Middle East countries also penetrate. This also creates opportunities for Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan particularly, that not only focus on China, but assess different opportunities, improve their relationship, and, as I noted before, follow balanced and multi-vector foreign policy. However, in the article, main things that I try to draw attention that if this trend continue like that, for example, if there is a more Chinese investment, that actually we saw that the new investment is coming, in the long term, this can create some negative output. However, on the other side, we saw that these countries try to multilateralize their relations, not only with country level, but also different development organization, international organization that show that they are not focused to keep balanced and multi-vector foreign policy and keep following to independent the foreign policy just outside of Russia and China.
You know, I was wondering how in other countries that are moving towards large-scale decarbonization of their economies, one of the big issues, and this is coming up a lot in just energy transition partnership countries like South Africa and Indonesia, a lot of the discussion is around the debt impact of these large-scale transitions. So I was wondering whether there's a kind of a similar conversation happening in Central Asia around this big shift towards green energy.
So in terms of their sustainability, in also article I wrote about China's changing financing. In the first phase, as I noted before, that mostly focused on investment to hydroelectric sector, we saw that, for example, China and Chinese bank, China Development Bank or China Export-Import Bank, they prefer to debt financing. They issue credit to Central Asian countries, and these countries realize the projects. That in the long term, we saw that in particular in Central Asia, this create doubt about debt problem with China or debt sustainability. However, currently, particularly in the context of green energy, we saw that after 2015, there's a shift in general, not in Central Asia, but generally in China's financing tools. Because China not currently, or Chinese companies not prefer to, or the Chinese bank not prefer to issue credit, but they prefer to cooperate with multilateral development organizations such as Asia Development Bank or EBRD and finance projects. And Chinese companies also prefer to equity financing rather than debt financing. This means that they currently green energy investment not create a huge problem about debt sustainability or debt in Central Asian context particularly. So in this context, we saw that actually when we looked at why the China change the pattern, it's most related about Central Asian countries' own preference, because these countries also start to require investment rather than debt or new debt. So that's why particularly in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, we saw that, for example, Chinese company Universal Energy involve equity financing, but in the same time, they also cooperate with Asia Development Bank or EBRD to realize this wind and solar energy. This pattern, I think that is also similar for the Middle Eastern countries in the context of the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia.
I'm just curious that you haven't mentioned the United States or Europe that much in our discussion, and I'm wondering if the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment or Global Gateway, these programs that are intended to compete with the Chinese and the Belt and Road Initiative, Are they active in Central Asia, and specifically in countries like Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan? Because they too claim that they're focusing on green energy as well.
Yes, I agree with you. Particularly, first, I would like to start with European Union. Again, last 2 years since the Russia-Ukraine war started, we saw that European Union particularly active in Central Asia. Not in the organization level like a European Union, but Germany, France, United Kingdom, they try to improve their relations with Central Asian countries, not only for the green energy, but transport and connectivity. For example, one of the most important topic is a middle corridor. The corridor that starts from China, goes through Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Turkey, and Europe. So in this context, we saw that European Union countries invest Central Asian countries. For example, Total from France also invests to renewable energy in Kazakhstan. They try to realize hydrogen-related projects. And also, as you know, currently there's a discussion between Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and Uzbekistan to create green corridor to export electricity or hydrogen to the European Union countries. So we saw that actually European Union is also actively involved in Central Asian affairs. That's why in the previous question I said that in the long term, the Central Asian countries not only try to improve their relations with China, but they also assess different actors such as Middle Eastern countries, also European Union. So we saw that in terms of particularly in the context of middle corridor and green energy or new potential projects such as hydrogen-related projects, European Union is particularly active in Central Asia. But I can't say the same things for the United States because, as you know, particularly after withdrawal from the Afghanistan, United States, the presence in Central Asia actually is, I would say, limited because there is no large-scale the investment from United States or in new projects such as particularly related to connectivity or green energy. In addition to this, we saw that Central Asian countries also particularly pay attention to multilateralize their relations with European Union, China, Russia, and Middle Eastern countries. So it's true that, for example, in the last 2 years, United States Development Agency provide new grant for Central Asian countries, or United States also create new platform for critical minerals with Central Asian countries. They are correct, but currently they are all in limited because they are based on dialogue rather than particular actions. So that's why I can say that the United States actually active like European Union or China in Central Asia currently, but it's evident that there is also a shift in United States, the attention towards Central Asia. And I expect that the particular importance of Central Asia getting grow in the United States foreign policy, at least in the medium term.
Not related to our conversation right now, but we recently did some coverage in our newsletter on Chinese plans to expand and integrate earlier Belt and Road Initiative rail projects in Southeast Asia into a more of a kind of a comprehensive rail network that links Chinese provinces to Southeast Asian countries, more comprehensively. And there are also in Central Asia, there are also these rail connections being planned and logistics corridors and so on being planned. And at the same time, we recently saw that I think Azerbaijan became the first foreign country to set up an agreement with Pakistan to use the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or some of those, which are also Belt and Road Initiative projects, particularly the port of Gwadar. So I was wondering, just broadly, if you're seeing a similar kind of integration through rail and logistics corridors happening in Southeast Asia. Is there a movement for China to be weaving these kind of corridors closer and strengthening these kind of logistical connections between Central Asia and China?
So, yes, absolutely. As you noted before, recently we saw that actually China continued to improve connectivity between Central Asia and China, also try to expand its influence through the South Caucasus because, as I mentioned currently, particularly after Russia-Ukraine, where middle corridor emerged, one of the most important corridor between for China and European Union connectivity. So Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, they are the main countries that play critical role in this corridor. However, as in terms of direct concrete example, recently we saw that China, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan signed agreement and they agreed on financing. China agreed to finance the main part of the railway and also it took 51% of ownership and also Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan took each 24% of ownership of the railway company. So we saw that particularly Russia not only focused on improve its connectivity between Kazakhstan, but also it started to spill over through Kyrgyzstan and Uzbekistan. Because currently, if we consider that the current situation in Russia and Iran, China particularly pay attention to develop their connectivity through the Central Asia. For example, in addition to China, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan railway, we saw that China also create joint venture with Kazakhstan to create new container hub in Akto port. Or we saw that China also support Kazakhstan to create third railway connection in the Kazakhstan and China border. So in this context, we saw that in addition to green energy, China also continued to continue to improve connectivity between China and Central Asia. And as you saw, it tried to also integrate other countries to China and Pakistan economic corridor. Particularly Turkmenistan is the first country to sign agreement to join this corridor, because currently it's very important for China to not only improve connectivity but diversify the transport routes. Because if we consider that Iran and Russia's situation is limited due to the sanctions, the Central Asian countries and also Southeast Asian countries for the alternative for China's connectivity project to diversify its export and import routes, find new export markets, also improve connectivity to European Union through Central Asia. So I agree that like Southeast Asia, China continued to strengthen its connectivity initiatives through the Central Asia, and also is getting not only Central Asia but also South Caucasus, because recently also we saw the Chinese company won tender in Georgia for realizing the Anaklia port, which is a critical part of the middle corridor. So I can agree that China currently is very proactive in connectivity project in Central Asia and South Caucasus.
Yunis, I want to take advantage of the fact that you're based in Istanbul right now and you follow China-Turkey relations quite closely. And this is a topic that I find particularly perplexing, because when you're confronted with one set of news that feels like China-Turkey relations are getting stronger and better, at the same time, then it turns right around and there's another set of news which says there's lots of strains in the relationship. Let me put a few data points up there for us to consider in this part of our discussion. Back in June, Foreign Affairs Minister Hakan Fidan went to China in a very high-profile visit, and he seemed intent on settling the Uyghur issue, where he went to Xinjiang, basically said, this is not an issue that we're going to get involved with. Now, that's important because earlier the Turkish administration made it clear, and President Erdogan was, a couple years ago, becoming the most outspoken leader of any Muslim-majority country about the plight of Uyghurs. At the same time, we get news, for example, that BYD is going to invest $1 billion in Turkey, lots of economic engagement, and things are going on. But then a couple of weeks ago, we get word that the Chinese embassy in Turkey is furious that Turkey announced at the same time that the foreign minister was in China, announced 40% tariffs on imported EVs from China. And so they're going to take the case now to the World Trade Organization to fight back against this. So again, lots of complexity in this relationship. Can you take any one of those points and help us understand what the state of the China-Turkey relationship is today?
Yeah, of course, it's very interesting. Actually, I agree with you that there's a currently very complex and complicated the relationship. But let me start first the Turkish foreign policy. As you see, currently, Turkey is the integral part of the the Western institutions. He has a very deeply engagement with Western countries. However, we saw that in the other side, due to the growing multipolarity in the international system, emerging of new developing countries, new markets, Turkey also tried to increase its bridge role between East and West. Turkey tried to improve its relations with China, Russia, and also other African countries, but in the other way, it tried to keep sustainable its relations with the Western countries, particularly the European Union. However, particularly in terms of China, we saw that recently there is a huge intensification in, I would say, in the positive manner, because as you said, BYD, the famous Chinese electric vehicle company, invest Turkey invest Turkey, and it's very important because it's a large-scale investment, not only create new job opportunities, new employment opportunities, but also the cover localization of some the electric vehicle, the products. On the other hand, as you said, there is also the Turkey also add new tariffs on the China for import of electric vehicles. So let's start with this. So we saw that there's an investment. This sign is a good relationship, but we should assess both of the event in the currently the global politics. As we saw, there's this tariff not only limited with Turkey, but European Union recently add new tariffs. United States also imposed tariffs on China's EV imports. So we should say that this imposition of new tariffs is not only about Turkey, but it's also a global trend. So on the other hand, China's electric vehicle investment also consisted with China's strategy, because due to this tariff, China tried to invest and create new plant in developing countries to improve its presence in these countries, but also export to European Union and United States from new countries to bypass the tariff in United States and European Union. So in this context, actually both events actually align with the global trends in China's rising role and also tension between China and the West. So we saw that Turkey also adapt. On the other side, investment signs a good relationship, but also it's imposed a new tariff aligned with the global trend of Western countries toward China. In terms of the Hakan Fidan's the recent visit, we saw that Turkey tried to keep relationships stable, but not only stable, but try to utilize the relationship for more positive direction. So that's why during his speech, he also referred to Uyghur as the main points between Turkey and China, not as a problem or issue, but also the bridge between two countries, because they belong to similar culture, similar civilization. So Turkey also tried to utilize this point as a positive manner or as a bridge to improve its relationship with China. But I would say that generally, which one in the context of complicate and complex relationship, currently Turkey is eager to, but also China eager to develop their each other relationships with positively rather than the negatively. So I think that maybe in the short term, there's some issues can happen like tariffs, or like, for example, we saw that China also complain about Turkey's new tariff, but I think that they will happen in the short term, but in the long term, both countries' interests align, not in terms of economic investment, not in terms of, for example, their relationship in Central Asia or in the different part of the world, but generally in the global, because both countries also interest to develop their relations, align at least more or less their foreign policy in the global level. For example, Turkey also interests the BRICS, as you know, and China is the main actor in the BRICS, and China support also Turkey's membership in the BRICS platform. So we saw that there's a complicated relationship, but if we assess generally, we saw that more positive trend rather than the negative trends or outputs.
You mentioned the issue of Turkey possibly joining the BRICS. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about how that would then end up positioning Turkey, as it would be as far as I understand it, the first country that would be both if it joins BRICS, it would be the first country that's both a BRICS member and a NATO member. And in that sense, it echoes then India's position as being both in the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and in the Quad. So I was wondering, does Turkey aim to be this kind of bridging power that works, that brings these different powers together? And how is that kind of just being stretched between these poles seen within Turkey?
Actually, currently, as we see, not only Turkey, but other developing countries, emerging economies, for example, you mentioned Southeast Asian countries, actually their condition was also more or less similar, because all middle powers, or let's say the small powers, they try to follow the balanced foreign policy. They don't want to choose between East and West, or China or United States, or United States, Europe, and China, Russia. So in this context, we should pay attention that Turkey is also has the same aim. Rather than choosing one side, Turkey's main aim, from my point of view, is about to multilateralize its relations with foreign countries, develop relations with China, Russia, but in the same time kept relationship with a stable relationship with Western countries. It is difficult because we saw that the relations actually fluctuated between West and East, also Turkey's relations with different countries. However, the main aim in the context of BRICS is the same. Rather than most of time, actually in media, we saw that Turkey's intention to join BRICS described as its new foreign policy strategy or new shift its foreign policy from West to East. However, I think that actually it's a main part of Turkish foreign policy because Turkey not only interested in BRICS, but also interested in Shanghai Cooperation Organization, but also tried to improve its relations with ASEAN, with South Asian countries, with African countries. So when we assess, I think that it's very important to look at the broader foreign policy of Turkey and how the BRICS fit in this foreign policy. So from my point of view, even if Turkey join or start to develop its relations with BRICS, the main aim is here improve the proactivity, improve flexibility of Turkish foreign policy, try to utilize new investment, particularly from BRICS countries or the China and Russia, but in the same time, they try to keep sustainable relationship with Western countries. As I noted before, it's difficult because currently the international system, the evolving, there's a multipolarity, there's a growing instability in the different parts of the world. But not only Turkey, but also other countries, I would say that try to follow the same strategy. And main aim of Turkey is keep its the regional power status, but also keep its bridge status between East and West.
Yunis, thank you so much for taking the time to cover, again, I promised a wide breadth of topics and you delivered. Yunis Sharifli is an independent foreign policy analyst specializing in China-Eurasia relations, specifically focused on connectivity and energy. He joins us today from Istanbul, and also he is the author of a wonderful commentary on the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace website that came out earlier this summer, Green New Wave, How China Adapts to Central Asia's Renewable Energy Landscape. We're going to put the link to that in the show notes, and so that you can check it out. Yunis, thank you so much for your time today and your fascinating insights.
Thank you very much, Eric Cobus. Nice to meet you again. Thank you very much for your invitation. I am very happy to actually discuss with you the regional politics.
Cobus, one of the most insightful takeaways that I took from the article, and Yunis touched on it as well, is this point on energy security. And I think that is a point that when you're sitting in a place that is abundant in energy and you flip the light switch and it goes on every single time, you don't fully appreciate. But this idea that a country like Kazakhstan, which generates huge quantities of crude oil, but yet still has an energy crisis, reminds me of the same discussion that we're having in Nigeria today, where Nigeria is one of the largest oil producers in the world, yet has chronic energy deficits because it doesn't have a lot of refining capacity. In fact, a new refinery, I think the first in Nigeria, the Dangote refinery, is coming online now. And so this idea that renewables, and solar in particular, wind as well, can relieve that because you don't need any refining capacity for solar, is something that is understated in terms of the importance for these countries that have large energy reserves, but also a large energy deficit at the same time. Seems contradictory, but it's a reality faced by a number of oil-producing countries.
That is very much true, I think, and it's part, I think, of a bigger trend of how solar and wind is increasingly kind of, cancelling a lot of rules that have structured development in the past. For example, that development necessarily has to flow from the big city to the rural area. The fact that solar microgrids can just be directly set up in a rural area without having to connect to a big city grid or a centralized power plant is changing the calculus, particularly in very large countries like Kazakhstan and Nigeria. It's changing the calculus of what it means to develop a rural area, or what it means to develop a kind of a decentralized kind of energy setup. And I think in that sense, I think in lots of ways, even though the small is beautiful is frequently When one speaks to Western stakeholders frequently, the dominant framing or the dominant assumption is that small is beautiful was kind of like flowery language put on top to sweeten what is essentially a budget reduction, right? Or like a funding reduction. And I think, sure, there is some truth there, but I think it's also what isn't actually, I think, taken into account there is that small is beautiful actually translates into, like, plays very much into this changed landscape where, you can drop microgrids across the landscape wherever you want to, rather than, kind of having to be bound to the logic of having to connect everything back to a big city, which really is a game changer, I think, for many developing countries, particularly very large ones like Kazakhstan.
Yeah, but let me push back on you a little bit on this, because what we've been experiencing here in Southeast Asia, I think, is instructive for what a lot of countries are facing in terms of the vulnerability of these microgrids that you're talking about. So up in northern Thailand and through really right down the Mekong, we've had terrible flooding. I mean, it has been a brutal typhoon season, much as it's already becoming a very violent hurricane season in the United States. What's happened out here is devastating. And one of the casualties of the massive rains and subsequent floods in Thailand has been a lot of the microgrids and the solar powers that was sitting on top of a lot of houses. So now we have a situation where it took a lot to get those microgrids in place. Climate change, ironically, wiped it out. And I say ironically because these microgrids are in response to climate change. But it shows you in many respects how the countries that are least responsible for the chaos that we're experiencing are suffering disproportionately. And I think how climate change will impact some of that in places like Africa as well. Then we have a second problem that you and I encountered when we were in Pretoria last year or the year before. And we talked with an expert who said that the farmers were putting up solar panels and then they were being stolen within 24 to 48 hours. So this all sounds great, but at the end of the day, there are realities that make it very difficult for the most vulnerable countries to be able to sustain a microgrid.
Yeah, it's true. But of course, those similar realities also play into some of the difficulties around having a power grid at all.
But if you had a centralized power grid, though, a big, oil refinery hooked to a grid, hooked to a distribution network, when it needs to be fixed, it's one place that needs to be fixed, for example.
Not necessarily, because like one of the biggest problems in South Africa in its, and South Africa still has very centralized power grids, all linked to a few big kind of mostly coal-fired plants. But copper wire theft ends up destroying that disrupting that just as effectively. So that, unfortunately, is something that everyone who runs a grid ends up facing. And as you say, something like a problem like flooding, ends up kind of affecting these countries unfairly, kind of in the process.
Yeah, we're seeing the effects here in Southeast Asia. It's been a terrible rainy season this year. I mean, just devastating. And Southeast Asia, in many respects, is a lot like Africa. Africa has contributed only 3% to global emissions, and Southeast Asia is about 6.8, 6.9%. And yet, again, these are the most vulnerable countries. So I'm in a place here in southern Vietnam, which is at sea level. So if you could imagine that when the sea levels are rising and salt water is coming into the marshes and it's impacting rice production. Also, I see the rivers now, just in my neighborhood, really surging much more this year than in previous years. And we have a lot of people in Ho Chi Minh City who live on the rivers. So the poorest people live right on the rivers. And you see these big shanty towns. When those rivers really start to surge and to swell, it causes immediate pain for a lot of people. And so it's becoming so apparent. There's no hiding from it anymore. I know a lot of people in the U.S. still deny, even including the Republican candidate for president, that it's a reality. But again, they're not paying attention to what happens in places like this and where
or in Florida right now,
Yeah, but they attribute Florida to, there's bad weather, right? Even though these hurricanes in Florida are far more than just bad weather. I mean, and my U.S. home is in California, they don't have a fire season in California anymore. They said it used to be there was a fire season, the dry season. Fire season now is January right through December. And then January, it's a year-round thing. We're dry all the time. and we're always on alert for fire season. But yet, all the data does not point to the fact that we are doing enough fast enough to reverse the trends. It's just not happening. And so
one of the kind of like related trends I think that we're going to be seeing more, and there was is just kind of large waves of lawsuits against, I think, like kind of class action lawsuits against some of the oil companies. I recently read a brief, kind of saying that there's a tsunami of those coming.
That may be the case, but let's not underestimate that how governments will protect those companies with new legislation. I mean, the United States government is not going to see its oil companies go under. I mean, and this was always the criticism of even the Norwegians, that the Norwegians, for all their happy talk about climate, are sitting on $1.5 trillion in their sovereign wealth fund that was generated by Statoil. I think at the end of the day, if Statoil gets pushed to the wall on a lawsuit, potentially a cataclysmic lawsuit, these people are going to fight. They're not going to go down easily, and they have enormous resources. So I appreciate the effort, and I'm not trying to discourage it, and I'm not trying to be condescending or patronizing in any way. And look what lawsuits did to the tobacco industry and to seatbelts and to airbags. So there's a lot that lawsuits can do. But this particular industry is so integrated into the power structure that I find it hard to believe that these lawsuits will have any meaningful damage. And they can actually have a reverse effect. You could have a BP sign a check for $100 million thinking, well, see, we got sued, we paid, we're doing our part to kind of turn around the environment. $100 million is a good Tuesday morning of revenue for this company. So you can get into a situation of greenwashing pretty quickly on a lawsuit settlement.
And the face of human evil. So here we are.
Welcome to the world in 2024, right? I mean,
but I don't think realistically it'll be one big lawsuit. What it'll be is like death by a billion cuts, right? Kind of like they'll bleed, but they'll bleed through billions of little paper cuts all over the world.
It would be interesting to see what happens. I mean, the profits on the oil companies today are so enormous that I can't imagine how much bleeding would be needed in order for them to truly feel the pain. We'll see.
It'll be interesting anyway.
But I still think this idea of countries in places like Uzbekistan and Nigeria who generate huge amounts of energy but yet face chronic energy insecurity is a really important contradiction that we have to study more and we have to be much more sensitive to. And this is what I think is so frustrating a little bit coming from the global north about talking to a country like Nigeria about green transitions and whatnot. And again, I said this in a previous show, I think these countries that have contributed nothing to the problem should be given free passes. I don't think that's politically correct to say, but I think that, here in Southeast Asia and in Africa, the whole JET-P thing, I don't get. Do you know what I mean? Like, Vietnam is not a major contributor when measured up against India, the US, Europe, Japan, Korea, and China. And yet JET-P is here. And, I know that South Africa is a major coal producer and considerably more polluting than any other African country, at least Southern African country, but still relative to the where the real problem lies, it doesn't make sense to me that that's the focus of our attention. Our attention needs to be where are the emissions still coming from? And they're still coming from the global north, and they're still coming from India and China. That should be where what we're talking about. And it's weird to me when I look at a lot of the environmental media in the world, and they focus disproportionately on the global south, but yet they don't focus anywhere near as much attention on the global north, which is still the major polluters, right? Am I missing something?
I think it depends on which environmental media one looks at. A lot of the people I read tend to focus a lot on the US, for example, but I guess it depends on different outlets. I completely agree. I mean, I've said many times that I think it's outrageous for Europe and the US to be using any natural gas or oil at all. now. Kind of they should be moving towards fully transitioning their economies onto renewables.
Yeah, but that's not happening.
In order to then to have the global south have gas as a transition fuel. Of course. But
yeah, I mean, but that being said, Europe, I think I saw a statistic the other day that Europe is close to generating. And I might have read this wrong, so please nobody quote me on this, but I think they're getting up to the halfway mark on renewable.
Yeah, but
and
still,
so it's going up quite a bit.
It's going up, but still, the fact that they're only at halfway is frankly pathetic.
Well, I mean, the U.S. is also going up, but it's not even near halfway yet. I think. I mean, I don't.
Yes, exactly, and it's still a huge oil and gas producer itself. Which it then sells to the rest of the world. So
number one, largest in the world. So
and kind of under Biden, we know that new investment in oil and gas is particularly also in the global south has spiked under Biden, which I think again is pathetic. But here we are, kind of again, face of human evil. Climate reveals it every time.
The politics just aren't there. I mean, they're really just not there. I just don't see it in the U.S. or in China or in India. It's just not there. I mean, China's doing a lot. There's no doubt that China is at both a leader in renewable energy, but also a leader in coal production as well. And so, I mean, both of those sit side by side with one another. And again, there's a lot of nuance to this. And every time we go down this path, I get quite a bit of mail from people saying, you don't know what you're talking about. And there's truth to that. I admit that. But what we do see, and I think we had a chart the other day in the newsletter that we showcased about Chinese coal production last year. It's pretty significant. And I'll leave everybody with this thought. I know the Chinese say we are entitled because we have the second largest population in the world and we're a developing country, and so we didn't cause the problem. The problem is today is that when we use that logic, it's like saying we're peeing in 1/3 of the pool. Okay? And if you're still in that pool, you're not safe. And that's the world we live in. So there's a robust argument on the Chinese side to say, you know what? You can't criticize us if you're hurling insults from New York and London and Brussels. Sorry, just not going to take that. I get that. But I think to your point, Cobus, that you make all the time, we're in the red zone now. So any contribution to emissions is terrible. And so here we go. Yeah, I mean, I didn't think we were going to go this dark at the end of the show today.
In general, as we've discussed many times, I have some sympathy for China's line that it is a global south country. On certain metrics, it makes no sense, but on other metrics, it does make a little bit of sense. But I think in this particular kind of energy generation kind of aspect, I fully don't see China as a global south country. And I think China should pull up its pants and move to fully renewable because it can. And we know that a lot of the coal power that it continues to fund is mostly for political and provincial developmental reasons rather than for technical reasons. I mean, I know there's technical reason to go with coal as well, but if there's one country in the world that can fully make that transition and benefit from it and profit from it, it's China. So let's go.
Okay, let's go. Let's leave our conversation there. We'll be back again next week with another discussion on what China's doing in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, South America. And we just have a lot of fun doing this. And every single day, we have a great team around the world that's putting together research, analysis, data visualizations, videos. It's amazing the quantity and the quality of the discussion that we're producing. And if you'd like to check out all the great work that the team is doing, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. And you can then sign up to get our China Global South Daily Brief that goes out every morning at 6 a.m. Washington time. You can then also see the videos, and increasingly we're going to be adding to our data sets as well. And we've got a brand new tab at the top of our website called Data Visualizations and Data Tools. You can also see our special reports. Cobus did an amazing job during FOCAC. He wrote a pair of reports before FOCAC, and he's written a report after FOCAC, the Forum on China Africa Cooperation. You'll want to check that out. We've got an amazing new report also about China and the nickel industry in Indonesia. So much great work is being done. Go check out ChinaGlobalSouth.com. And don't forget, if you are a student or a teacher, you get half off. Email me, Eric, at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I will send you the links for the half off discount. So definitely take advantage of that. So we'll leave it there. I'm Eric Olander in Ho Chi Minh City, and for Cobus van Staden in Cape Town. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. Until then, thanks so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter @ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.